object theoretical orientation is more important than methodological, because I think we are quite blind to choose and apply any methodological tools if we don't know and understand what we are studying, what is the object of our research. And that's why I am talking about semiotics of education, or edu-semiotics. And first, some background of semiotics of education. I can start from my own dissertation thesis from 2004. It's in Finnish. And second, very and much more remarkable work was Andrew Stable's Living and Learning as Semiotic Engagement from 2006. Quite soon after that book, Professor Stable's called a series of seminars about semiotics of education. From this basis was founded an international network for semiotics of education, which has a web page held in the server of the Faculty of Education of our university. It has been working from 2008 and is still working. The works of this network has been published in special issues in Educational Philosophy and Theory journal and the Journal of Philosophy of Education. Then the term edu-semiotics was coined in 2010 by Marcel Danesi in a foreword for book Semiotics Education Experience, edited by Inna Semetsky. And in 2014, last autumn, the edu-semiotics was launched formally as a branch of semiotics in the Conference of International Association of Semiotic Studies in Sofia. The two most important comprehensive publications about edu-semiotics are collected book Pedagogy and Edu-semiotics from last year, edited by Stables and Semetsky, and Edu-semiotics, which is co-written by Stables and Semetsky, and it was published in this year. And there is a special issue coming in the journal Semiotica of International Association of Semiotic Studies. Edu-semiotics, or semiotics of education, is quite heterogenic area, like also semiotics is as a whole, from structuralism via pragmatism to post-structuralism and constructivism and so on. What is common is the role of science in education, perhaps critique against some forms of Cartesian substance dualism, the stress of processual views and the stress that it's not only question about cognitive issues. Perhaps the critic is much against the analytical tradition of education, and these semiotic theoretic views are quite near to continental Bildung tradition and also pragmatist views. There are many connections, also historical connections. I have quite much here as a shortened history of and introduction to semiotics generally. I don't know how much I should use time for this, perhaps not very much. But the main topics are in the slides, and they are the historical roots already in Antique and Middle Ages, then Charles Sanders Peirce's American tradition of semiotics, and de Saussure's continental or European tradition, the influence of biosemiotics, and then for my approach, which I call action theoretical semiotics, there are very important influence from I. Greimas and also a Finnish pupil of Greimas, Eero Tarasti, which I will pass here altogether, and then I will say something about my own development of action theoretical semiotics of education. It must be remembered that semiotics has long roots along the history of philosophy. It is not so new invention as sometimes is claimed. Also in antique Greek there was a study of science, mainly and partly with medicine, a study of symptoms. And then in Middle Ages the main philosophers elaborated very strongly the concept of science and their role in human affairs generally and in learning especially. They discriminated between natural science, which were known already in Antique, and artificial science, and also the holy or religious science. Often their view is referred by this formula aliquot stat pro aliquo, that something stands for something else. But this is too restricted. It was not about two-point relationship, but they were already developing a triadic relationship of sign, which was then important for Peirce, especially. The not so well known Portuguese schoolman João Poinsot was very important figure here. This development of semiotic thinking was somehow stopped when the modern age started. The modern philosophy was not so clearly semiotic anymore. But then Charles Sanders Peirce in United States in the 19th century, remarkable scientist and philosopher, was a scholar of medieval writings and also continental philosophy, and also influenced by Darwin's evolution theory. He developed a triadic metaphysical view as his general whole philosophy. It consists of three categories: simply firstness, secondness, and thirdness. Where the firstness meant something vague, quality, change, or chance or possibility. The secondness is something more concrete, something existing and efficient. And then thirdness is a synthesis of these two, like some habit or law. You can see strong influences from Hegel and Kant here. And Peirce stressed explicitly pansemiotic view that the whole reality is a semiotic process, and all research is semiotic research for Peirce. Semiotics is same as logic, and it's also same as science.
I have a question. What is these three metaphysics? What are they in reality? Could you give an example on the firstness, secondness, and thirdness?
I think I can, because the Peirce's semiotic theory, or the theory of science, or the semiosis process, is based on this category theory, and it is often depicted as a triangular structure or process, where here is the corner of called representamen. Peirce used strange terms and coined own terms based on Greek and Latin terms, and that representamen is often a synonym of sign or a sign vehicle. It's something that acts sign, as in medieval age, that something which stands for something else, and that object is that something else. And this sign is the firstness, and object is second. Sign is something that can be, it's very vague, it can be or not be, it can be different and change. An object is something more concrete.
So it could be a physical thing.
It is not necessarily a physical thing.
It could be.
It could be. It often is, but it can be also idea or thought or something else. And the third is the interpretant. It is often you can translate it almost as meaning. It's meaning of a sign, but it's not very strict. Rather, it is a new sign, and this representamen refers to object, and the interpretant refers to object also in some sense similar way as the representamen. The interpretant is a new sign. It is a more developed sign, and so it belongs to the thirdness category. For example, I can hear a sound. It's a quality. It is a firstness. Then that sound can be a representative of some object. For example, it is a sound of a car which is coming against me. I hear a sound of a car, and it is a sound of a car, and I create an interpretant which is my idea of a car. It refers to the object. It can also, it need not be a thought, an idea. It can be, for example, my reaction. I can react by going away from the way of the car.
Object and representative always go towards the interface.
Yes, in the semiosis is just this process that representative is referring to object and creating an interpretant which is also referring to object. And it can be, for example, that a typical sign, like an icon in the computer screen. It is a sign of some object. The object is perhaps a program, and the interpretant is like its name refers. It can be like my interpretation of the icon, that that must mean that. The icon must mean that. And this semiosis process, there are...
Can it also be like what the icon is used for? Like
Yes.
Not just interpreting what, like how do you use the icon? And maybe interpretant too.
Yeah. Because interpretant is a new sign, and it can be a sign or representative of a next semiosis process. And so there is a theme of open-ended or limitless semiosis. That when we see or perceive or think a sign of some object, it creates a new interpretant, and that will necessarily be a representative of a next semiosis process, and it will then create a new interpretant, and so on. It is a continuing interpretation process from one semiosis to next one and next one. Percy's theory is quite well depicting perhaps any kind of learning processes, and it can be used to that. But what is missing in Persian semiotics is that it is very much restricted just to learning, not to. It is not very well available in education or teaching learning processes. that was shortly that. Then there is an other root of modern semiotics, the European new invention of semiotics by Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who was living quite at the same time as Peirce, but they had probably no connections between them, and their interests were quite different. While Peirce was a metaphysical philosopher and natural scientist, de Saussure was strictly a linguist and only interested in linguistic research. And his main accomplishment was a trial to answer to the question, what is the object of linguistic research? And his answer was that it is a language system. The famous discrimination between la langue and parole, where la langue refers to the language system as a extra subjective system, while parole is the subjective use of language. And Saussure stressed a synchronic view. He was not interested in historical changes of language, but he thought that first must be studied language at one moment. He didn't claim that language is an unchanging structure, like many have interpreted later, but he just meant that we must first study synchronically, and only after that can we start to make diachronic or historical study of changes of language. And central part of the language system is a sign, a linguistic sign. And the sign is a triadic structure. It has two sides, not three like Peirce, but two. And these two sides are signifier and signified. And later translations are perhaps more easy to use. That signifier is an expression side of a sign, and signified is the content side of a sign. Here is the linguistic sign of horse. That expression side here is the Finnish word hevonen, and the content side is the idea of horse. It is the idea of the language user.
So what do you mean by the idea of the language user?
I mean that when the language user perceives the expression, then she creates the content side. And the sign works, or it is a sign, only when there is a quite fixed and strict connection, so that all or almost all of the language users create the similar idea when they hear the similar sounds or see the similar marks in paper. So there is a rule, often called code, which says that for this expression you must connect this content. In the also for Saussure, the signs exist only inside the language system. As for Peirce, sign can be also only as a part of a semiosis process. For Saussure, sign can be only a part of a language system. And in language system, the sign and its meaning are determined only by their negative relations to other signs. This means that the horse, the idea of horse is just that idea because it is not an idea of cow, it's not an idea of a dog, it's not an idea of a car, and so on. It has, Saussure says that it has no positive meaning, no positive content. It's only differences from other concepts. And so the expression side similarly. And these two sides of a sign are connected together arbitrarily, so that in different languages there could be any expressions referring to any contents. And this system of differences then lead to the development of structuralism proper in Europe by Claude Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, Louis James and so on, and then later to post-structuralism, represented mainly by Jacques Derrida. Although Saussure made his own study just for language, the human language, he stated in his main posthumous book that there could be a science called semiology, which would study other sign systems. And that's why those later structuralists started to develop semiology as a study of different kind of, or any kind of sign systems. And it was a quite long time in the near history that there was two very strictly different traditions of semiotics. The other one was the continental, and it was called semiology, and the other one was American, and it was called semiotics. But nowadays there is only one general term, semiotics, and also the traditions have much communication together. Then I will shortly refer to the a little later theoretical biologist Jacob von Uexküll, who is the founding father of so-called biosemiotics, or the semiotics studies of biological systems. As you may guess, the term edu-semiotics is copied from the idea of biosemiotics and some other branches similarly named. Jacob von Uexküll wrote in 1940 an article, A Theory of Meaning, where he launched the term Umwelt, which became a very heavily used term in philosophy. In philosophy, biology, semiotics, and some other areas also. And peculiar to Umwelt is that it is a meaningful environment of an organism for Ykskul or for human being in other theories. So it consists of science. And connected to this is another of a perhaps more important invention by von Ykskul, the idea of functional circle, which is depicted here. Here is the organism. It's the meaning receiver or subject, and it has two kinds of organs. It has a perceptual organs and effector organs. And these effector organs affect its Umwelt, and the perceptual organ receives the effects of Umwelt. It has very much influence in many branches of science and philosophy. For example, technological theory of feedback systems, and so on, outside philosophy also. But then the most important authority for me has been Algirdas Julian Kreimas, who has lived in the last century in France. He was a founder of the famous Paris School of Semiotics. And the specialties of Kreimas are these different sides that he stressed: a processual and subjectivist side of semiotics, even though he was a very keen student of the structuralist tradition, but he mainly interpreted the structuralism as a methodological principle. He studied signification processes like Peirce, but also the semiotic systems it requires uses, and he was not so much interested in the science as Saussure or even Peirce, but he was more interested the smaller elements of science, for example, so-called themes. And especially the larger signifying wholes, which consists of science, and they are called discourses. So discourses are the main research object of Kreimasian semiotics. Also, here is the narrative view to discourses. Anyway, he was striving for very much for scientific theory. His empirical research, hypothetical deductive method, formal meta-language, refrain for all metaphysical speculation, and so on, which makes him quite safe authority. The main inventions of Kreimas are, one of them is the semiotic square, which is perhaps best meant for the study of those smaller elements of sign, but it can be used in any levels. It is from the one side it is some kind of operationalization of structuralism. This is a basic structure of everything or anything, but mainly it is a heuristic tool to analyze anything that can have a structure. The structure of this square is that there are three kinds of relationships. These horizontal relationships are contrary. They are incremental, inclusive, permissive, opposition. Like, for example, good and bad, man and women, young and old, and so on. Contradictory relations are the diagonal. They are absolute, exclusive, and they mean the negation. It's a relationship between A and not A, man and not man, good and not good, and so on. And then there are the complementary relations. Vertically, they are conditional or presupposing. If there were, for example, good and bad, they are inclusive. They are both needed. There can be no good if there is no bad. So it is not a contradictory relationship. But if here is bad and here is not bad, it is the negation of bad. They are exclusive. But then not bad is complementary to good. If something is not bad, it can be good. Or if something is good, it is not bad. And so there is a process built in this model that something can change to its opposition if it goes through the negation. This is a so-called dialectical trajectory from good via no good to bad. If you negate the goodness, then you can get badness. And the second and a little bit larger tool is a so-called generative model or generative trajectory, which is used in the analysis of discourses. It is also a processual structure, and the main idea here is the discrimination between deep and surface structures. And simplified, there is in every discourse there is a deep level which consists of the fundamental value structure. Then there is a semi-narrative level which contains actants and actions, and then there is a discursive level where are the most important details, like individual actors and their features and time and space structures and so on. This can be used many ways, and it's best to think this also as a heuristic tool. You can analyze any discourse by trying to discriminate the different levels, and you can start from one level. Perhaps you can start from discursive level, the most surface level, and see what there is, and then try to see what are the deeper levels and what is the most deep level. This can be also thought like, for example, Finnish Kari Salosaari has used that tool for creation, so that you can start creating a discourse, for example, a text or a poem or something, that you first decide what are the fundamental values, and then what is the semi-narrative structure, and then you add there the needed details. In the deep level, there are the basic values, the fundamental structure, and according to Kramer, there can be two types of discourses: idiolectal, individually experienced discourses, and sociolectal discourses. And the difference between these are just the basic values. In idiolectal or individual discourses, the basic values are life versus death, and the basic values of sociolectal discourses are culture versus nature. And these oppositions should be always analyzed in semiotics, where, as we will see. In the narrative level, there are the actants and action, and this action is caused or motivated by the value structure. The actants, which is also one invention of Kramer's and very famous, it means the basic roles. And the basic roles in any discourse, basic actantial roles, are subject and object, and then perhaps sender and receiver, or sender-receiver, and then perhaps helper and opponent. And these are abstract roles. In principle, there is one subject and one object in a discourse in this narrative level, but in the discursive level there can be many actors which are in different actantial roles. And the action, the most important and most well-known action sequence or narrative schema is the so-called trajectory of subject, which consists of 3 phases or 3 tests. The first is the manipulation, where the sender actant sends the subject to some task. The second is the performance, where the subject tries to do the task, to acquire the object. And then the third test or phase is called sanction or glorifying test in narratology, where again the sender or sender-receiver or receiver or receiver evaluates the accomplishments and competence of the subject according to the performance. This is the basic structure of most discourses. Someone sends someone to do something and then evaluates if it was a success or not, and sanctions the subject according to that. But the most important invention by Kreimas, from the point of view of semiotics education, is, I think, the concept of competence and modalities. Here you can see or guess that these terms, competence and performance, are borrowed from Chomsky, but Kreimas uses them quite differently. The subject's action is determined by its competence. Now, the competence is a special property of a subject which makes it possible for the subject to act in the way it acts. And it's also partly vice versa, so that the way how subject acts, it determines its competence. And it is exactly the process of learning when the competence of a subject changes along the action. It does. Kreimas discriminates between the proper or neutral or so-called semantic competence of doing something, like the competence of riding bicycle, or competence to sing, or competence to write, and so on. And always connected to this neutral competence, there are connected the modal competencies. And the modal competencies are depicted in natural languages by so-called modal subverbs. In English, they are want, can, know, and must. And so we have 4 important modal competencies. So that if someone has a competence of riding a bicycle, some other one can have a similar competence to ride bicycle in a similar way, but their competencies can still be quite different depending on those modal competencies. The other one may want to ride, other one wants not to ride. The consequences are quite different. I think this is perhaps the most important lesson from Kreimas to practice of education, that we must take these modal competencies into account perhaps more than we do. Then I will say something about the project of action theoretical semiotics of education. This is a synthesis of the previously described theories, semiotic theories, mainly Kreimas, and continental pedagogy, and also I have added there the ontological theory developed by C.B. Martin and John Hale. But I will not talk about this at this time. What I mean with a continental pedagogy, I mean a tradition from already Comenius via Rousseau to Kant and Herbart, and then to modern so-called Allgemeine Pädagogik tradition. And peculiar to this tradition is the discrimination between the concepts of education or educational influence or teaching as something what the educator do, and Bildung as a process which takes place in the educated person. And the problem of pedagogical paradox, which rises as a tension between these quite contrary concepts or views to education. And first we could look at the deep structure of education. I have tried to apply the Gramscian semiotic square to analyze the basic or deep structure of education as it is depicted in the Allgemeine Pädagogik theories as four main principles. And the four main principles, they are the principles of growth ability, originally Bildsamkeit, the principle of demand for autonomous action, and the principle of social and cultural contextuality of education, called with different names in Germany. And fourth, the principle of better or open future, the höhere Bildung der Menschheit principle in German. And when we look at these, when we set these principles as concepts to the semiotic square, we can easily see that education must be seen as a sociolectal discourse. Its main values are culture versus nature, and we can think that the culture value is represented by the contextuality principle, the role of the prevailing social environment, and the nature value is represented by the growth ability principle, because in a way the growth ability or Bildsamkeit of a human being, it is a natural property. It is based on the natural abilities of a human being. And this natural being, then it is negated or criticized by the demand for autonomous action, by the educator's active action or discipline, like it is often expressed in educational traditions. And this discipline or demand for autonomous action makes possible to become a member of a culture and society. But this culture and society or membership in it can be more or less unnatural. And so it is restricted from the point of view of our natural possibilities. So it is criticized by not culture, by the rebellion, the strive for different and better future, a better culture and better society. And this is done for the give more possibilities to our natural growth. This is not strictly similar as the discourses, many discourses studied by Kramas, because in narratology the object of research has often been a folk tale, more or less pre-modern culture, where there are very strict axiological evaluations, so that culture is good and nature is bad. For example, fables of princes and dragons. But in modern education, at least from Rousseau on, the nature has got a very positive value. There is not so simple good and bad, but both culture and both nature, they have good and bad sides. Both are criticizable. And that is one peculiar feature of modern education. But let's go on. The concept of action is, of course, central in action theoretical semiotics, and this is the model depicting the idea or concept of action. And it is much similar than the functional circle of Jacob von Uexküll. There are two-way interaction between subject and the object side, the environment, many objects actually. And there is an outward effects, the doings of the or deeds of the subject, and then there is an inward effects, the perceivings of the subject. But this circle can be further divided to two circles, the internal side of action and external side. The external side, external action is perceivable for an external observer. We can see what someone else does, and we can perhaps see what she sees also. We can perceive what she perceives. But the internal action is not perceivable, but it is actually very important in human action. And we may think that it consists similarly as a outward and inward processes, and they can be called planning of doings, and the evaluation of perceivings. And for human being, this internal action can be very strong and very independent from external action. We feel that we can plan deeds and then we can refrain from doing them, we can evaluate them before we do anything, and we can continue this planning and evaluation however long without almost never doing anything. And here are a little bit in a different place the competencies of the subject. They are changing. They are determining the subject's action so that a subject can do only something for which it has competence. Competence determines and restricts the action of the subject. Also, the features or properties of the environment determine and restrict our actions. And when we act, we are doing or trying to change the properties of our environment. We are trying to change the objects, or we are trying to keep them similar. And when we are doing that, our competencies are changing. This is the only understandable way how our competencies can change, or at least how their changes can be, how they can be developed by doing. It is by doing something, by action. But in action we are not changing our competencies. Our action is always directed outward to environment. We are never changing our competencies. We cannot change our competencies by ourselves, and still more difficult it is for other persons. No one can change the competence of other person, but not even competencies of oneself. But they are changing as a side effect of our action. So this means for education, of course, that if we want to change or develop someone's competence, the competence of our students, perhaps, then we must somehow cause them to act, to do something. And what they do, what is the action that they do, it will affect the development of their competencies. Unfortunately, we have no real laws or rules so that we could know that doing what will develop what competencies. I think that we have some kind of law or hypothesis of similarity, that doing something, action, acts, it will develop competence for doing something like acts, something similar. But I think that's best we can have. The problem is that we must, if we want to develop competence to do action, acts, then the subject's action must be something else. I must do U to develop competence for X. Because if I want to develop competence of X, I can do it only if I don't have that competence already. And if I don't have the competence to do X, then I cannot do X. Then we or students must always do something else than the competence that we are striving for. I hope you understand my English.
It's a little bit difficult to understand for example, prose. So, if I do something else, I understand this way that maybe I have to watch more. I have to understand what I draw. So I probably will become a better drawer.
Yes, that is true. If we, for example, practice drawing, we draw something, we draw what we can draw, but as a consequence of our practicing, we can then draw something else, something better, something different, which we cannot do before we practiced. And so this is where the hypothesis of similarity is very strong. We learn something similar than we do, but not just the same. If we already can do something, then we cannot learn it, because we can learn only something that we cannot do yet.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Another question. So what makes you think on this? We're seeing this model and the other one, that both of them is structuralist. So what is the post-structuralism as modern?
The X-skills. Do you mean the X-skills?
Yeah, like the other ones.
Yeah. Mainly, the most important difference, it is very much the same. The most important difference is this internal idea of internal action. It is missing from Jakob von Exkel's model. Even though I think that also animals, at least animals as organisms, they have some kind of internal action. Not so remarkable or strong as human beings, but something still. I think I cannot know because it is ineffable.
I guess there is also thinking that this is there is rationality in the processing, like finding and evaluating things. Assuming that we are being rational on our.
Yes, we think that human action is often rational, and we hope that it is, and we try to develop it to be more rational. So the rationality is part of our competences, and I think that the human action can be more or less rational, and namely the human rationality, what we think about human rationality, it is we think that it is based on the internal action, that we consciously elaborate what we are doing. This is also missing from the X-skills model. Also from X-skills model is missing the idea of the changing competencies, which I have stressed in.
Uncomfortable. The competencies more fixed. They can change. There's so many that can be.
I think that it was not an important question for Jakob von Exkel. It is not so important question in biology generally. But Then about the dynamics of the modal competencies. What is the role of modal competencies in learning and action? Here is a different model, and this is also circular, even though this is not drawn as a circle, but the process is circular, and this could be depicted as a circle. And here we can start from modality of wanting. It is a quite natural starting point. We can think that action of any subject, human or otherwise, it starts from wanting. Always when any subject is doing something, it first wants to do something in a way or another. And then when the subject or we want to do something, then our action can start or continue. And then there comes the second modality of can. And here we also have two possibilities. We can do or we cannot. If we want to do something, we may start to try to do something, and we may success or not. If we can do, if we have the modality of can, then we will success. If we don't success, it means that we didn't have the modality of can. We could not do it. It was a failure. And so, first, if we want to do something, we start to try to do something, and then we also, depending on the environment, we can or cannot. And when we do this one or more times, we can think that we get to the third modal competence. We start to know what we can do and what we cannot do, how we can do something in some environment and how we cannot do. There are many possibilities in this dynamics. First, we want or not want to do something. If we want to do something, then we can try, and if we can do something, then this process can go on. If we cannot do something, then there can be a feedback loop so that we do not want anymore, or we want to do something else, or we don't want to do this now, we try again later, or in a different environment. And while these trials, successes and unsuccessful trials happen, then we will collect some kind of knowledge about our possibilities of action. When we want to do something and we can do it, and we know how we can do it, or when we know when we can do it, or we know where we can do it, then we can develop the modality of must. And here we have still more different possibilities. This must is the most interesting modality, and also I think the most important for semiotics of education. And For this, I will go to the last slide about the levels of Bildung or levels of learning. I have differentiated, or actually with Jani Kukkola we have differentiated 3 levels of learning or Bildung. The lowest or the most basic level is called pragmatic, actually pragmatic learning. And this means that we are working with technical challenges. Typically some material or technical tasks. We must find food or start a computer or something like that, or write an essay or so on. And here the beginning of the modal circle goes just like we depicted earlier. We want to do something, and we perhaps can or cannot, and we collect knowledge about how we can. And then the modality of must will take here the form of technical norm. This is or conditional norm. This is an important invention, I think, made by George Henrik von Wright as a part of a practical inference or practical rationality, and it is part of the theory-practice relationship of empirical analytical science. And the technical norm says that if you want to do X, then do Y. Or if you want to do A, then you must do B. It's conditional. If you want to do, then you must do. It's not the proper norm saying that you must do something, but it says that if you want to do something, then you had better do this, because you will success if you do this. And this is just a pragmatic form of the modality of must. The modality of must, actually it is some kind of second level wanting. For example, I want to eat a candy, but and I could eat a candy. I have a candy here and I could eat it. But I know that if I eat it, then my teeth will start to ache. I will get a toothache. Then my modal competence of must could be that if I don't want to get toothache, then I must not eat that candy. And that must will change or override my original wanting to eat. I will not eat it even though I want to eat. And similarly, perhaps not so dramatically, we think in technical situations that if I want to get that, then now I must do that and I must do that. In the social level of learning, things come different. In the social action, there are those complex actantial structures which are analyzed in Gramscian narratology. There are, in addition to subject or I and object, which I want to do, there are senders and receivers and perhaps opponents and so on. I have to take into account the wantings of other persons of other subjects. Perhaps I want to eat the candy and also some other one wants to eat it, and there is only one candy. Then I must think, then I have to think that may I eat it, or must I give it to the stronger person? And then the norms become a proper social norms, that we must do something and we must not do something independently of our wantings. In this social level, as one form of social norms, develops the human language, and we become language users. And that makes it possible for us to continue or further to the third or the highest existential level of learning. And perhaps this is the properly a level of Bildung. What is characteristic for this level is again the transformation of the competence of must. The modality of must becomes again different. Here happens the so-called awakening of the conscience. We do not anymore blindly or slavishly follow the social norms or the norms of the stronger or the rules of the stronger, but we are, because we can use language, we can here rationally deliberate what is right and what is wrong, independently of the existing social norms or social relationships. And we can start to develop some kind of universal moral responsibility. And this all happens in the sight of the development of our other competencies of working and acting with different kind of cultural tools and so on. But I think this is very much the core of the human growth. Yes, this is all from my side. Thank you, and questions or comments. We have used our time, and thank you very much.